Safety in phlebotomy.
Let us discuss the infection control. But first, let's break down what the word infection control means. When we say the infection control, it is a discipline concerned with preventing healthcare associated infections. There are also two types of infection control. First is the nosocomial infection, and second is the community acquired infection. But let us focus first on the nosocomial infection. When we say a nosocomial infection, it is an infection that is healthcare associated. This means the infection has exists in a certain location only, which is the hospital. Some examples of these are ventilator-associated pneumonia, urinary tract infection, and tuberculosis. Second is the community-acquired infection. When we say the community-acquired infection, it is infection picked up after admissions to the hospital. So this means the infections are not contracted inside the hospital but outside the hospital. Common example here is the common colds, flus, skin infections, and etc. But we could prevent this by washing our hands, sanitizing it, and proper use of medical apparatus or medical stuffs. There are also types of infections. First is the local infection. When we say a local infection, it is the infection restricted to one area of the body only. This means this type of infection has not spread but remains contained near the entry site. The best example here is a cancer that has not extended beyond the margins of our organs. This can be described also a localized infection, while the cancer that has extended to the tissues are described as massive. Second is the systemic. When we say systemic, infection that affects entire body, it affects more larger portion of our body than the local infection. But not all systemic diseases are infectious. For example is the diabetes. It is an autoimmune disorder that is caused by infections, and it is a systemic disease. But most STDs and HIV viruses are also localized to genitals. However, some of them can also be systemic. The third type of infection is the autogenous. When we say the autogenous, it is infection from patient's own flora. It is caused by a microorganism which belongs to microbial flora of the patient. The word auto means in the autogenous implies that the infection is not transmitted from person to person, but it is within ourselves only. There are also two types of infections in the autogenous. First is the injection site. When we say the injection site, an abscess occurs on the site of the injection. When the needle penetrates the skin, the pathogen can be pushed through the surface of the mucosa. Second is the bacteremia. When we say the bacteremia, the bacteria that travels through the bloodstream of other parts of our body. While antibiotics, amoxicillin are the best medicines for these types of infection. Hand washing, sanitizing, and using of medical apparatuses are very important to prevent this type of infection.
Now, let's move on to the infection control communicable disease cycle. First is the infectious agents. Infectious agents are organisms that are capable of producing infection or infectious diseases. They include bacteria, fungi, viruses, and parasites. Next is the reservoir. Reservoir of an infection agent is the habitat in which the agent normally lives, grows, and multiplies. Reservoirs include humans, animals, and environment. The reservoir may or may not be the source from which an agent is transferred to a host. For example, the reservoir of Clostridium botulinum is soil, but the source of most botulism infections is improperly canned food containing Clostridium botulinum spores. Next is the portal of exit. Portal of exit is the path by which a pathogen leaves its host. The portal of exit usually corresponds to the sites where the pathogen is localized. For example, influenza viruses and Mycobacterium tuberculosis exit the respiratory tract. Schistosomes through urine, cholera vibrios in feces, sarcops scabuli in scabies skin lesions, and enterovirus 70, a cause of hemorrhagic conjunctivitis in conjunctiviral secretions. Some blood-borne agents can exit by crossing the placenta from mother to fetus, while others exit through cuts or needles in the skin, or blood-sucking arthropods. Next is the mode or means of transmission. Modes or means of transmission is the route or method of transfer by which the infectious microorganisms moves or is carried from one place to another to reach the new host. The modes of transmissions are contact, droplet, airborne, vector, or common vehicle. Next is the portal of entry. Portal of entry refers to the manner in which a pathogen enters a susceptible host. The portal of entry must provide access to tissues in which the pathogen can multiply or a toxin can act. Often, infectious agents use the same portal to entry new host that they used to exit the source host. For example, influenza virus exits the respiratory tract of the host and enters the respiratory tract of the new host. In contrast, many pathogens that cause gastroenteritis follow so-called feces-oral route because they exit the source host in feces, are carried on inadequately washed hands to a vehicle such food, water, or utensils, and enter a new host through the mouth. Other portals of entry include the skin and blood. Lastly, is the link in the chain of infection is a susceptible host. Susceptibility of a host depends on the genetic or constitutional factors, specific immunity, and non-specific factors that affect individuals' ability to resist infection or to limit pathogens. And now, after I discuss the communicable disease cycle, let's more elaborate the modes or means of transmission. The modes or means of transmission is when an infectious agent may be transmitted from its natural reservoir to a susceptible host in different ways. There are different classifications for modes of transmission. Here is one classification: the direct transmission. Direct transmission is when an infectious agent is transferred from a reservoir to a susceptible host by the direct contact or droplet spread. And the other one is the indirect transmission. Indirect transmission refers to the transfer of an infectious agent from a reservoir to a host by suspended air particles, inanimate objects, or animate intermediaries. Under direct transmission, we have direct contact and droplet spread. Direct contact occurs through skin-to-skin contact, kissing, and sexual intercourses. Direct contact also refers to contact with soil or vegetation harboring infectious organisms. Thus, infectious mononucleosis, or the kissing disease, and gonorrhea are spread from person to person by direct contact. The example of this is hookworm is spread by direct contact with contaminated soil. Droplet spread refers to spray with relatively large, short-range aerosols produced by sneezing, coughing, or even talking. Droplet spread is classified as direct because transmission is by direct spray over a few feet before the droplets fall to the ground. Example of this is pertussis and meningococcal infection are examples of diseases transmitted from an infectious patient to a susceptible host by droplet spread. Under indirect transmission, we have the airborne transmission and the vehicles transmission, and lastly is the vector-borne transmission. Aerosol transmission, or commonly known as airborne transmission, this encompasses the transfer of pathogens through very small particles or droplet nuclei. Aerosol particles may be inhaled by a susceptible host or deposited onto mucous membranes or environmental surfaces. This can occur from breathing, coughing, sneezing, or vocalization of an infected individual, but also during certain medical procedures, examples suctioning, bronchoscopy, dentistry, inhalation, anesthesia. Very small particles may remain suspended in the air for extended periods and be disseminated by the air currents in a room or through a facility. Examples of common aerosolized pathogens includes Bordetella, Bronchoseptica, canine influenza, and canine distemper viruses. Next one is the vehicle transmission. Vehicle transmission refers to the transmission through a contaminated source that may indirectly transmit by an infectious agent. This includes food, water, biologic products, and fomites. Fomites are inanimate objects such as handkerchiefs, bedding, or surgical scalpels. A vehicle may passively carry a pathogen, as food or water may carry hepatitis A virus. Alternatively, the vehicle may provide an environment in which the agent grows, multiplies, or produces toxin. As improperly canned food provide an environment that supports production of botulinum toxin by Clostridium botulinum. Lastly, vector-borne transmission. Vector-borne transmission are vectors, living organisms that can transfer pathogenic microorganisms to other animals or locations and include arthropod vectors. Examples of these are mosquitoes, fleas, and ticks, and rodents or other vermin. Vector-borne transmission can be an important route of transmission in climates where these pests exist year-round and may be brought into the practice by an infested patient. Examples of vector-borne diseases include heartworm diseases, Bartonella infection, and Lyme diseases.
Standard precautions. Standard precautions are meant to reduce the risk of transmission of bloodborne and other pathogens from recognized and unrecognized sources. They are the basic level of infection control precautions which are to be used as a minimum in the care of all patients. 5 points of standard precaution. First is the wash hands. The most important measure to prevent the spread of infection among patients and medical personnel is hand hygiene. In hand disinfection, if there is no visible contaminations of palms, it is mostly done with antiseptics. When doing hand washing, make sure to rub the disinfectant agent into all areas of the palm. Enable it to air dry after washing your hands. The second point of standard precaution is wear gloves. When it comes to phlebotomy health issues, hand and gloves are a primary concern. Compromised gloves should be replaced right away and gloves should be changed between patients as precaution to avoid accidental passage of fluids. Between gloves change, hands should either be washed. The third one is gowns and lab coats. Gowns and lab coats are worn to protect the skin and to keep healthcare workers' clothes from being soiled. Gowns are disposable and they can only remove by touching the inside surface to prevent contact with the infected outer surface. Lab coats are typically made of a fluid-resistant material with long sleeves and knit cuff. It is provided in both reusable and disposable version. Next is wear mask and eye protection when appropriate. Masks are worn to protect the medical personnel from sneezing and coughing droplets. The menthol band and mask must be secured snugly over the bridge of your nose, shielding the mouth and nose. Protecting the eye, nose, and mouth from body fluid splashes is done with goggles and face masks. Lastly, use designed sharp containers. The last precaution has to take is to protect ourselves and general public from harm by safely disposing all the medical waste left over from the phlebotomy procedure. Taking the trash out when procedure is finished help protect others from getting blood-borne disease from a needle stick.
Good morning. For this video, I'll be talking about the tactics to reduce risk of exposure to blood-borne pathogens. The first one is engineering control. Engineering controls are designed to protect the workers from hazard by placing a barrier between the workers and hazards. Engineering control isolate or remove pathogens hazards from the workplace. This includes the sharp containers, self-sheathing needles, and safety medical devices. My example for this is, if we are dealing with contaminated needles and contaminated sharp, they will not recap or remove. Needles and sharp needed to be, or as soon as possible after use, needed to be placed in some kind of appropriate sharp containers until it properly reprocessed. Second is work practices. The phlebotomist should wear well-fitting non-sterile gloves when taking blood. You should also carry out hand hygiene before and after each patient, before putting on and after removing gloves. It is very important for the phlebotomist to maintain the sanitation because yun pwedeng yung maging dahilan na maka-adapt yung mga patient ng bloodborne pathogens or infections. Examples of these work practices are wear gloves and lab coat or gown when handling blood and body fluids. Change gloves after patient or when contaminated. Wash hands frequently, and etc. Next one is housekeeping. Housekeeping is important not just because of cleanliness, but it also includes keeping the work area neat and orderly, or to help or eliminate workplace the risk of exposing to these bloodborne pathogens. Good housekeeping is a basic part of incidents and prevention to control or eliminate the work from hazard and infections. Number 4 is hepatitis B virus vaccination. But first, I'll be giving some infos about hepatitis B virus. Hepatitis B virus is a common serious liver infection. It is caused by hepatitis B virus that attacks or injure the liver. So how this hepatitis B virus can be transmitted to one person to another? Could be transmitted through blood and infected body fluids, also in unprotected sex and unsterilized or contaminated needles. Hepatitis B vaccine series will not benefit or clear the virus. However, the vaccine will provide a lifetime of protection for loved ones and also to those person who is also infected by the virus. Hepatitis V virus vaccination serve as the prevention of infection caused by all known subtypes of hepatitis B virus. The vaccine results in long-term defense against the virus that may develop serious disease. To correlate this hepatitis B virus vaccination to of reducing risk of exposure to bloodborne pathogen is it stand as a defense, especially hepatitis B virus can be transmitted through blood and other body fluids enter to the body of person who is not infected by this virus. People can also become infected by this virus through people whose sex partners have hepatitis B. People who share needles, syringe, and other drug injection equipments. Number 5, private rooms. Having a private rooms will reduce the instance to get exposed to pathogens because there is such a disease that is transmitted human to human. A patient in a private room also such a more control over his or her environment in ways that are not possible in shared room. Yes, it is very important din po sa patient na magkaroon ng private room, especially kung masyadong sensitive or the disease is transmitted. So, it is very important na magkaroon sila para hindi na dumami yung magkakaroon ng ganong sakit or makadevelop yung iba ng ganong sakit. Lastly, is the personal protective equipment. A phlebotomist must use latex gloves, goggles, gowns, and face masks when blood exposure is possible. PPE provides a barrier against infection to protect the skin, airways, and clothing of an individual. Also, it is very important that all PPE is used and disposed of correctly in order to protect those wearing it and prevent the spread of infection. Oh, these are the examples of PPE. Gloves, gowns, and masks. Meron pa po siguro yung iba pero hindi ko pa na-include. So these PPE are very important for the phlebotomists. Not only for the phlebotomists but also to our frontliners, especially now that we have pandemic. This PPE will be served as their defense for their health.
Evolution of isolation techniques. Isolation designed to minimize the transmission from infected patients. It prevents for us not to have some diseases and viruses and not to spread it. It helps us to limit our contacts with the other people and have some physical barrier. Category specific isolation. Number 1 is strict isolation. It is the diseases spread by contact and air. It is the skin-to-skin infect that cause chickenpox and pneumonia. Next is contact isolation. It is the transmittable diseases spread by direct contact. Ito ay may pagkasimilar sa strict isolation na nanggagaling sa skin-to-skin na nagkakause ng scabies. Next is respiratory. It is similar from contact and strict isolation. Mga airborne diseases through air and cause mumps. Next, isolation of patients with tuberculosis. Number 5, drainage or secretion. It is the skin infections, mga sugat, or mga accidental skin cuts na nag-i-infect sa ating katawan. Next, enteric. It is patients with severe diarrhea due to contagious bacteria. Number 7, protective or reverse. It is protecting the patient from the healthcare worker. Based on 7 isolation categories. Strict isolation. It requires all types of personal protective equipment whenever you go in the room. Respiratory isolation. It requires wearing a mask. Next, protective isolation. It protects people with an immune suppressed status, and you would have sterile gowns and etc. Enteric precautions. It is the diseases transmitted by the fecal-oral route. Next, wound and skin precautions. For large draining wounds that couldn't be contained with a dressing. Next, discharge precautions. It is the smaller wound that could be contained using dressing. Last, blood precautions. It is because HIV was not in the picture. It designed for hepatitis B infection. Blood and body fluid precaution added. It is the precaution are not absolutely necessary unless these fluids contain visible traces of blood. Transmission-based isolation. It is the airborne droplet and contact. By spreading by skin-to-skin contact with the other people and with the patients with have some diseases and microorganisms. It's designed to emphasize the caution and help us to prevent these diseases.
Occupational Safety and Health Administration or OSHA standard. OSHA standard are rules that describe the methods that employers must use to protect their employees from hazard. So, ginagamit nila ito para maprotektahan ang kanilang employees at iwas na rin sa mga hazard na natatagpuan sa workplace. Types of hazard in a workplace. This is common. First is safety hazard. It can cause injuries, illness, and also death because these are slips, trips, and falls, and also a faulty equipment. Second is chemical hazard. This is the exposure, na-expose tayo dito sa mga chemical. At ang pangatlo ay biological hazard. Dito na yung mga body fluids, bloods, mga diseases, at saka mga animals na naano natin. OSHA regulations in a workplace. First is cleanliness. Phlebotomists must be washing their hands before and after working with patients. After removing personal protection equipment such as gloves and any time they are exposed to blood or anything else that may carry infection. So dito kailangan natin maging malinis para iwas na rin sa mga bacteria. OSHA regulations in a workplace. First is cleanliness. So, phlebotomists must be washing their hands before and after working with patients. After removing personal protection equipment such as gloves, and anytime they are exposed to blood or anything else that may carry infection. So, kailangan dapat natin panatilihin ang pagiging malinis, lalo na sa ating katawan at lalo na rin sa mga utensils and also in our workplace. So, kasi para na rin iwas tayo sa mga bacteria and also infection. Second is disposing of materials. Needles and tubes used to collect blood must be immediately disposed of in a proper sharp container. OSHA regulations require containers to be sealable, resistant to punctures, leak-proof, and easily accessible. The container must be color-coded, red, and labeled biohazardous. So, sa disposing of materials, kailangan nakalagay siya sa container para iwas na rin sa mga hazard na mangyari at dapat nakalagay ang biohazardous. Third is personal protective equipment. So, kapag kukuha tayo ng dugo or kapag tayo ay isang phlebotomist, ay kailangan natin ng PPE. Personal protective equipment protects the employee from contact with blood or other infectious materials. This includes latex, gloves, goggles, and gowns, and face masks. Pang-apat ay disposable of blood. So, sa pag-dispose ng blood, hindi dapat kung saan-saan lang itatapon. Kailangan may paglalagyan ito ng maayos at hindi siya pwedeng ikalat sa kahit anong lugar. Phlebotomists must use proper technique and care to avoid splattering or dripping blood. OSHA regulations mandate that any maternal exposed to blood or other infectious matter must be disposed of in a container labeled biohazardous. So, dapat siyang ilagay sa biohazardous. Reusable materials must be properly disinfected to remove any possible infection. 5 is state safety and health plans. OSHA regulations encourage states to develop and run their own safety and health plans. State plans must be listed as effective as equivalent federal regulation and include inspections to enforce rules and safety training programs. OSHA standard basic requirements. What are the responsibilities as an employer? If you are an employer covered by the OSHA Act, you must provide your employees with jobs in a place of employment free from recognizing hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Among other actions, you must also comply with the OSHA statutory requirements, standards, and regulations that in part require you to do the following. So, as an employer na nakaano sa OSHA standard ay kailangang provide well-maintained tools and equipment including appropriate personal protective equipment. So, sila ang magpro-provide ng mga tools and equipment kasama na rin yung mga PPE. Then, provide medical examinations for the employees. Third is provide training requirement by OSHA standard. Report to OSHA within 8 hours accident that result in fatalities. So, kailangan mai-report sa OSHA within 8 hours. Report to OSHA within 8 hours accident that result in the hospitalization of 3 or more employees. Keep records of work-related accidents, injuries, illness, and their causes, and post annual summaries for the required period of time. So, kailangan ma-record ang mga accidents, injuries, illness, at saka yung mga causes nito. Then, a number of specific industries in the retail service, finance, insurance, and real estate sectors that are classified as low hazard are exempt from most requirement of the regulation, as are small business with 10 or fewer employees. Post prominent the OSHA poster informing employees for their rights and responsibilities. So, ang employer kailangang ipopost niya yung mga at saka kailangan niyang ma-inform yung mga employees about sa mga rights and responsibilities ng mga employees. Then, provide employees access to their medical and exposure records. Do not discriminate against employees who exercise their rights under the OSHA Act. So, dapat wag natin sila i-bully, discriminate. Post-OSHA citation and abatement verification notices at a near the work site. Then abate cited violations within the prescribed period and respond to survey requests for data from Bureau of Labor Statistics or OSHA or a designee of either agency.
Hello everyone, I am Marisa Guayaban. I will be discussing about the laboratory techniques. So these techniques are beneficial for it demonstrates proper blood collecting skills at all times. So let us go. The must in phlebotomy practices. All procedures involving blood or potentially infectious materials are to be performed to minimize splashing, splattering, or generation of droplets. So we have here the universal precautions as an approach of infection control. So according to their concept, all human blood and certain human body fluids are treated as if known to be infectious for HIV, HBV, and other blood-borne pathogens. They are responsible in any infection that may cause by the mentioned wide spreading of droplets. These blood-borne pathogens are microorganisms that are present in human blood and can cause disease in humans. More of this will be discussed about the response to accidental biohazard exposure. Moving forward, healthcare associates must wear gloves and protective clothing when working with any potentially infectious material. So number one here is the equipment. This includes the materials for hand hygiene, and personal protective clothing must be routinely available in sufficient quantities. Practice universal cautions include the personal protective equipment, so-called as the PPE. So by this moment, we have seen already many samples through television and media outlet used by our great health providers as their protective suits consisting of cups, gloves, face covers, goggles, face masks, or respirators or other devices intended to protect from injury or the spread of infection or disease like the COVID-19. So another one is the antiseptics or the disinfectant which prevent the growth of disease causing microorganisms. Sample of this is the application of the alcoholic solution. So number two, also, it is best to buy high quality items even if they are more expensive. This will now fall the equipment of high quality based on cost effectiveness analysis of the world's needs and finances. Trying to save money by purchasing cheap items that of poor quality can be more costly in the long run. Why? One good example of this is when items needs to be replaced frequently. So to sum up the key points regarding this topic laboratory technique, it is best to prioritize the safety. As a health provider, it is also need to provide the stability of health in yourself. Always be mindful of that.
Material Data Safety Sheet. Material Data Safety Sheet is a document relating to occupational safety and health for the use of various substances and products. So this safety data sheet is provide or giving information for the workers about on how to dispose different said chemicals and how to use those chemicals. SDS is required to be created by the chemical manufacturer, distributor, or importer and provide to downstream users. The purpose of this SDS or safety data sheet is to ensure that all workers who handle chemicals have hazard information they need to safely use and store them. SOHA has started communication standard. Health Canada Women's and many other hazard communication standard around the world required this SDS for the workers. So SOHA and other hazard communication standard is requiring the employers to provide the workers the SDS in order to inform them about the chemicals they come into contact with, and also they make sure that the workers will receive training on how to read and understand those what is written on safety data sheets.
National Fire Protections Association Keyword for Action, RACE. RACE offers an easy-to-remember four-step evacuation method that can be used to minimize panic and confusion in the event of a fire emergency. There are four steps involved in RACE evacuation plan. First step, remove. Second step, alert or alarm. Third step, confine or contain. And the last step, extinguish or evacuate. Aside from the RACE evacuation plan, staff training is also very important in the laboratory. While a risk evacuation procedure is a very useful tool to have, the acronym should never replace fire equipment evacuation training. Training is critical for staff members to truly understand their role in an emergency. RISK should be there merely to help them jog in their memory. This is why phlebotomists should at least know how to use fire extinguisher. How to use fire extinguisher? Just remember the word pass. P stands for pull the pin, A stands for aim at the fire, S stands for squeeze the handle, S stands to sweep side to side. First step, pull the pin. This will allow you to discharge the extinguisher. Second step, aim at the fire. Aim at the base of the fire. If you aim at the flames, which is frequently the temptation, the extinguishing agent will fly right through and do no good. You want to hit the fuel. Third step, squeeze the handle. Squeeze the top handle or lever. This depresses a button that releases the pressurized extinguishing agent in an extinguisher. Fourth step, sweep side to side. Sweep from side to side until the fire is completely out. Start using the extinguisher from a safe distance, then move forward. Once the fire is out, keep an eye on the area in case it reignites. Class fires are extinguished using specific fire extinguishers. Class A fires. Fires involving solid materials such as wood, paper, or textiles. Class B. Fires involving flammable liquids such as petrol, diesel, or oils. Class C. Fires involving gases. Class D. Fires involving metals. Class E. Fires involving live electrical apparatus. What to do if there is a fire emergency? Major fire emergency. Alert people in an area to evacuate. Activate nearest fire alarm or call security number. Close doors to confine area or to confine the fire. Evacuate to safe area or exit building through stairwell. Do not use lift. Do not use elevator. Have person knowledgeable of incident and laboratory assist emergency personnel. Minor fire emergency. Alert people in laboratory and activate alarm. Mother fire or use correct fire extinguisher. Always maintain accessible exit and avoid smoke or fumes. Fire prevention to all phlebotomists. This is what we should do. Phlebotomists should be familiarized with the emergency plan. Have a written emergency plan for your space and or operation. Phlebotomists should undergo safety and equipment training, just like what I have said earlier. Exercise the emergency plan and learn to use the emergency equipment provided. For example, fire extinguisher. Phlebotomists should recognize laboratory hazards. Phlebotomists should know the different hazards in the laboratory, not just fire hazard but also other hazard present in the laboratory. Phlebotomists should observe proper housekeeping and proper storing. Keep work areas uncluttered and clean frequently. Put unneeded materials back in storage promptly. Keep aisles, doors, and access to emergency equipment obstructed at all times. Store solvents properly. Example, flammable chemicals should be stored properly in their specific storage. Phlebotomy should observe proper safety practices. For example, using solvents in any quantity have a very high potential for flash fires, explosion, rapid spread of fire, and high toxicity of products of combustion. Observe restrictions on equipment. Example, keeping solvents only in an explosion-proof refrigerator. Keep barriers in place. Shields, hood doors, and lab doors. Wear proper clothing and personal protective equipment. Phlebotomists should always wear proper cloth. They should wear clothes that doesn't expose their skin from feet to head. For example, no slippers or shorts. The type of PPE should also depend on what laboratory activity you do. Phlebotomists should be familiarized with the structure of the laboratory and should always be prepared in case of fire emergency. Know what to do. You tend to do under stress what you have practiced or pre-planned. Know where the things are. They should know the nearest fire extinguisher, fire alarm box, exit, telephone, emergency shower or the eye wash, and first aid kit, and etc. Be aware that emergencies are rarely clean and will often involve more than one type of problem. Working alone is not encouraged for phlebotomists. Why? You shouldn't work alone, especially in the laboratory when dealing with dangerous chemicals. Just in case if something happens to you, you have someone to rely on. For example, in the case of when your clothes got fire or the clothing fires instead. So what we should do in case of there is a fire emergency or clothing fires. This is the step. Extinguish burning clothing by using the drop and roll technique or by dosing with cold water or using the emergency shower if it is immediately available. What if your clothing catches fire? This is what you should do. First, do not run or take other action that will fan the flames. Second step, immediately drop down and roll on the floor to extinguish the flames. Laboratories are also equipped with fire blankets for extinguishing clothing fires. Will be used if necessary to smother the flames completely. Next step. After a clothing fire is extinguished, remove contaminated clothing carefully to avoid further damage to the burned area. Next step. Remove heat with cool water or ice packs until tissue around burn feels normal to touch. Next step. The injured person should be covered to prevent shock. And lastly, get medical attention immediately by calling emergency services.
Chemical safety. Handling chemicals is a typical part of the day-to-day routine for many lab workers, but the risks and hazards remain the same. Many organic and inorganic chemicals are corrosive to the skin and to the eyes and can be toxic. Full safety wear should be provided to any members of the team handling chemicals, and provisions to treat any exposure or clean spillages should be present in the laboratory. Important tips: identify method and safe practices to minimize the risk from exposure to chemicals and from physical hazards. It is important to consider safety hazards against chemical-related experiments to avoid physical harm to our body. Understand the nature and limitations of personal protective equipment, chemical hoods, and other safety equipment. We must be fully aware with the proper use of PPE, equipments, and any other safety protocols to secure ourselves. Locate online and printed materials to identify safe practices and consult with more experienced chemists. We must also link ourselves to different warning precautions, either a poster or through online, and it is required for us to value tips from the chemists. Wear personal protective equipment such as splash goggles, lab coats, or aprons and appropriate gloves. The dress code in a lab should be such that there should be no exposed skin below chest level. Wear a suitable PPE equipment in proportion to what lab activities we will be doing. Use appropriate waste containers when discarding chemicals. Lastly, we should ought to secure waste management against harmful chemicals to avoid accidents and thereafter. Before an experiment, pre-experiment analysis may be the most important step you can take to minimize the risk in any laboratory setting. Incidents can happen even in the best prepared scenario. However, careful attention to detail can minimize the risk. Number 1. Carefully develop a list of all the chemicals used and the quantities needed in an experiment. Be certain to fully explain and demonstrate any new procedures or techniques that will be introduced in the experiment. 2. Use appropriate containers for chemical distribution in the laboratory. Ensure that all containers used for distribution are clearly and completely labeled with the name, formula, and concentration of the chemical. Safety information such as signal words and GHS symbols should also be concluded. Consider the physical arrangement and the facilities available in your laboratory. If an experiment involves the production of volatile materials, or if you are using flammable solvents, ensure that there are adequate fume hoods and ventilation to provide a safe environment. During an experiment, wear the appropriate personal protective equipment or PPE and clothing. Chemical splash goggles are an absolute requirement in all chemists' laboratories and should be worn at all times. Laboratory aprons, coats, and gloves should be used to protect clothing and skin. Gloves must be changed as soon as they are contaminated. Contaminated gloves as well as aprons and coats must be disposed properly. Long hair must be pulled back and clothing must be tucked in. Jewelry should be removed. Open-toed shoes or sandals are not allowed in the laboratory. After an experiment, before leaving the laboratory, return any chemicals, excess reagent, product, or waste to the appropriate locations or dispose of them as instructed. Prevention. When it comes to chemical hazards, effective prevention is the best way to manage the risk of working working with these dangerous substances. Practicing proper chemical segregation is essential in all labs, as some substances can react with each other to create chemical reactions, fires, and even explosions. Protective clothing and good housekeeping are also important for protecting your team from chemical hazards.
Good evening po everyone. Yung i-discuss ko po ngayon is yung two types of safety hazards in phlebotomy. Actually, we have 6 safety hazards in phlebotomy. This includes the chemical, physical, electrical, fire, or the explosive, sharps, and then the radioactive. Yung i-discuss po natin ngayon is yung radioactive. So, ano po ba yung radioactive? Ano po yung tinutukoy natin kapag sinabi nating radioactive? Kapag kasi sinabi nating radioactive, it is the spontaneous emission of radiation in the form of particles resulting from a nuclear reaction. So, ano-ano nga ba yung sources na to? So, we have 3 main sources or major sources, which are the equipment from the laboratory or the laboratory equipments, and then the medical equipments, and then the radioisotopes. So, and in radioactivity, meron siyang pwedeng possible injury can be acquired from it, which is the radiation exposure that results to radiation sickness. So, ano nga ba yung radiation exposure? So, ito siya. It is the electric charge freed by such radiation in a specific volume of air divided by the mass of that air. From radiation sickness, ito yung mga symptoms na ma-experience natin. So, having a radiation sickness can contribute to both short-term and long-term mental problems such as grief, fear, and anxiety about experiencing radiation accident or radioactive accident or attack, mourning friends and family who haven't survived. So, as phlebotomists, here are the things that we should do in order to prevent radiation sickness or the exposure of radiation. Phlebotomists must be aware of the institution's radiation safety procedure. Phlebotomists are required or we are required to wear exposure devices such as a spatial apron or cover gown. Monitoring devices for exposure may include a badge to detect exposure through radioactivity. Awareness of radioactive hazard symbol in order to avoid exposure from radiation.
Electrical safety. Even the most experienced research professional can overlook basic safety principles when working with electricity. So it is vital that protective measures are employed throughout the laboratory. Particularly hazardous are electrical units which are positioned close to liquid. So this should be fitted with ground fault circuit interrupters to break the circuit should any current flow to ground. Electrical fires are another common laboratory hazards, which can occur when incorrect or unsafe codes and plugs are used. Any electrical appliances used in the laboratory should be fit for purpose, up to date, and correspond to connected devices before they are implemented. Any electrical apparatus, from adapters to cables, not safety tested could compromise the safety of the lab and research team. Prevention. Electrical hazards can easily overlooked in labs, which tend to have more health and safety risks than in other workplaces. Electrical hazards are potentially life-threatening. However, so minimizing their risk is vital. All power outlets that could be exposed to wet conditions should be equipped with ground fault circuit interrupters. Flexible extension cords should also be well maintained and never used as a substitute for permanent wiring. Electrical pendants can be used where possible to keep cords out of the way. Emergency. If someone comes into contact with a live electrical source, it is important not to touch them, as you could also be electrocuted. Instead, turn the source off or push them clear of the source of the shock with a dry implement, such as wooden broom handle. Your team's trained member should administer first aid in the case of a small electrical fire. Use a multi-purpose fire extinguisher. Never put water on an electrical fire.
So this time we'll be tackling about the needle stick injury, or what we call the NSI in phlebotomy. Actually, needle stick injury is included in our safety hazard, which I just mentioned earlier. Particularly sa sharp siya. Yes, sa sharp. And then, kapag sa needle stick injury, ano nga ba ito? So, yung needle stick injury is air wound caused by needles that is accidentally puncture the skin. So, itong NSI na ito is a hazard for those person who work with hypodermic syringe and other needle equipment. This can occur anytime when people use, disassemble, or dispose of needles. So, according to Dole, in the Philippines, 68 of the institution have current data pertaining to NSI and have existing policies and guidelines regarding reporting of NSI. 32% said that recapping of needles was the primary cause of NSI. That is according to Dole. So we as medtechs and phlebotomists, we have majors and minor roles to prevent this incident or this kind of accident. So here are the steps to take following the needle stick injury. So remember, if a phlebotomist experience a sharp injury during work, immediately wash wounds with soap and water. Flush out mouth, nose, or skin with water. Irrigate eyes with water, saline, or sterile irrigants. Report the incident to your supervisor. Yes. And then immediately seek medical treatment at the nearest emergency room or treatment facility. So here are the role of phlebotomists in avoiding needle stick injury. We have two major roles. So first is that avoid using needle whenever safe and effective alternatives are available. And then the second one is avoid recapping or bending needles that might be contaminated. So following after that, we have ways to prevent needle stick injuries. So we have 8 ways to prevent NSI. So lastly to follow are the safety during exposure of NSI. So if you experience a needle stick or sharp injury, or you are exposed to the blood or the other body fluid of a patient during the course of your work, immediately follow these steps. We have 5 steps to follow. Okay. Wash needle stick and cuts with soap and water. Flush splashes to the nose, mouth, or skin with water. Irrigate eyes with clean water, saline, or sterile irrigants. Report the incident to your supervisor. Immediately seek medical treatment to the nearest ER.
Response to accidental biohazard exposure. A biohazard is spills in an unintended release of a potentially infectious materials. So these includes body fluids such as blood, tissues or organs, and other stock cultures. So these are the things to do as a response. First, wash exposed area with soap and water. So this is given, and take note, no specific evidence shows that using antiseptics or squeezing the wound will reduce the risk of transmission of a blood-borne pathogens. Using a caustic agent such as bleach is not recommended, so better to use water instead. So secondly, report incident to supervisor immediately. If the incident occurred at work, immediately report the incident to your supervisor. Then follow institution's guidelines regarding treatment for follow-ups. So prompt reporting is essential because in some cases, post-exposure treatment may be recommended and it should be started as soon as possible. Discuss the possible risk of acquiring HBV, HCV, and HN, and the need for post-exposure treatment with the provider managing your exposure. You should have already received the hepatitis B vaccine, which is extremely safe and effective preventing HBV infection. Take note, you are protected by OSHA's blood-borne pathogens standard. So this document can help you understand your rights. So, exposed associate must be tested for HIV and HBV if consent is given. Source individual's blood is tested for HIV and HBV is if and only if it was given a consent. So, blood-borne pathogens means pathogenic microorganisms that are present in human blood and can cause disease in humans. These pathogens include, but are not limited to, hepatitis B virus and human immunodeficiency or the HIV. So, if source patient refuses testing, is HIV or HBV positive, or it is in high risk category, associate may elect to receive prophylactic treatment. This treatment is a preventive measure. The word comes from the Greek word an advance guard, an apt term for a measure taken to fend off a disease or another unwanted consequence. A prophylactics is a medication or a treatment designed and used to prevent disease from occurring. So I'll be ending this lecture with a note. Wherever you are, you must always preserve being prompt in all cases and be knowledgeable. Definitely, this will let you survive even on your own.